Welcome, welcome. If you'd like, you can write your location in the chat and also maybe your interest in signing up for this class if you have a short thing to write there. And while we're getting started and waiting for others to maybe to join, I'll give just a brief roadmap so you know what you signed up for, which is this is 3 sessions tonight and also March 11th and 18th. So 3 Tuesdays. And folks coming in from all over, very nice. And we're going to explore the suttas that pertain to the Dhamma in brief, as was stated in the title of this. But we're also going to look more generally at this process of transforming through hearing the teachings. It's an interesting and pervasive process. And that will take us out into other suttas. So we're going to start with the ones that are focused on the Dhamma in brief as advertised, but I have the feeling we're going to expand from there. Oh, yeah. Delighted to see so many of you. Okay. So, the Pali Canon, which is what we often study here at the Sati Center, is a very rich resource for taking different angles or perspectives on specific aspects of the Buddha's teaching. And so this class is a foray into what is called the Dhamma in brief. And that refers to times where the Buddha was asked by a disciple to give a brief nugget of his teachings, typically before they were going off on a retreat. So they would come to him and kind of ask for a pith teaching, if you will. And they would say, I'm going to go off and practice. What should I keep in mind? In fact, I want to just jump right in with the language that's used in the suttas. It's a very, one of those things called a pericope. It's a stock phrase that you could cut and paste from one sutta to another that's the same language every time. And this one, for this kind of teaching, goes like this. Venerable Sir, it would be good if the Blessed One would teach me the Dhamma in brief, so that, having heard the Dhamma from the Blessed One, I might dwell alone, withdrawn, diligent, ardent, and resolute. So that's their way of saying, I'm going off on retreat, and please give me some gem of wisdom to take with me so I can practice. And this word, Dhamma in brief, is a translation of Sankitena Dhammang, where Sankitena literally means concise or brief. But I was speculating, this is now my interpretation, maybe we could use the word condensed, implying that this is a shortened teaching that contains everything that's essential for the wholeness of the Dharma. It's not really just that the Buddha is giving them a particular piece of the whole, even though it sounds like that, but he's giving them something that could be a representation of the whole. It's good enough to stand for all of it. So it's an interesting question, right? You know, the Buddha gave a lot of different teachings throughout the Pali Canon in many different situations to different people. And here he is being asked to bring it all in to a specific set of instructions for someone to work with. You know, so what is the heart of these teachings, or the essence? You know, what would that be, really? So we'll see in a moment. I'm not going to keep you hanging forever, but note that the person says right there in the question that they ask, they say that they're going to go and practice with this teaching. They're going to go off and dwell, diligent, ardent, and resolute, which are, again, stock phrases for I'm going on retreat. And so they're not asking for a philosophical point. They're not asking for something theoretical. They want to know what to do while they're sitting there on retreat. And so if you look at the Buddha's responses to this request, he was almost always very happy to reply with a definite answer. He gives them something, a straightforward answer to that. Sometimes it's a little more extended than others. Sometimes it is not exactly brief, but often it's pretty brief. So my sense is that he liked that people were going off to apply his instructions. He was happy to go along with that. There were a couple of cases where he gently chides the person before he gives an answer to the question. We'll see one of those today. But mostly he just happily responded and gave them what they wanted, some kind of a condensed teaching. So I like to think that maybe this Dhamma in brief idea is that whatever we get as a little essential piece of Dharma is only meaningful when it's unpacked through meditation. So it might be that what we're reading and hearing about today will seem a little bit brief, but if one were to go and practice with it, there would be ways that it would unfold. And so I'll try to bring it to life a bit as we discuss this. So today we're going to focus on the instances in the Pali Canon where the Buddha was asked to teach the Dhamma in brief, and there are 44 of them. So don't worry, we won't go over all 44 in detail. As far as I know, there are 44 of them. And taken together, we could say that they give a picture of what the Buddha considered to be the essential areas of focus for a person who was going to do a dedicated period of practice. So that might be interesting for us if we ever do retreat, or if we are feeling like we would like to hone in on something that we know is going to be valuable. And in the majority of the cases, the person came to awakening during their retreat, but not all of them, actually, not all of them, but in the majority, more than half. So nonetheless, even if they didn't come to awakening, my guess is that it was presumably a meaningful teaching for them in some way. And that's why it was preserved in the suttas. 44 is not an insignificant number. So it's valuable to look at these as a whole, but I'd like us also to remember that each person received just one of them, and the idea was that they could practice starting from this short cue, if you will, and therefore unfold the whole fullness of the Dharma. And one possibility, how did the Buddha choose what to give to a person? One possibility is that he tailored his suggestion a little bit to the person who was asking, knowing something about their mind so that he could give them the right cue for what would work for them. So again, that's a little bit of a speculation, but there's some evidence for that as we go through. So another topic that we'll discuss in this class is the overall idea of getting a pith teaching or a nugget at just the right moment and using it to go far in our practice, maybe even using it to awaken. Or at least to transform in some way, let's say. I think intuitively we could say that this is appealing. We like the idea that the mind can be ripe in a certain way, maybe like a supersaturated solution, such that a short teaching could bring about a real shift. We like that idea. A supersaturated solution is one where it's any disturbance to it will easily be the seed for a crystal to form. Only a slight disturbance. So wouldn't that be cool, right? Wouldn't it be cool if our mind were poised there and we got just the right teaching and boom, there we could transform in some way. So I think that's appealing. I have to say immediately, though, we do have these suttas, and that's why I got interested in them and wanted to do this research and share it and kind of discuss it. I'm definitely hoping this will be participatory. But I have to say that in a broad sense, the early Buddhist teachings are not big on this idea of a sudden, amazing shift. There's a little too much potential for magical thinking, or the idea that a powerful guru could somehow make somebody awaken by zapping you in just the right way. So in the early Buddhist teachings that we look at, we have to do our own work. So here's a translation of a verse from the Dhammapada. It is up to you to make strong effort. Tathagatas only tell you how. Tathagatas are Buddhas. So it's up to you to make strong effort. The Buddha's just going to tell you how. And maybe that's what this Dharma in brief teaching is. So I think, though, that this is in keeping with the idea that people come and ask the Buddha, that they're not actually asking him, please tell me something that will zap my mind into awakening. They come and they say, I'm going to go off on retreat. Please give me instructions. So you can hear the difference between those, right? Please do something to me, and please give me something that I can use to practice for myself. They have a very different flavor, those two requests. But I want to back up to an even bigger picture for context before we zoom in. And that is that in Buddhist history, there is a difference between different schools or traditions of Buddhism around the idea of sudden versus gradual awakening. Is this something where it's a big bang moment, or is it something where there's a long path that you kind of tread over time? And it's a particularly prominent difference among the northern schools that evolved in China and Japan and Korea. Some of those were and still are actually called sudden schools. They're called sudden schools because they advocate this idea of a sudden transformation. And then there are some that are gradual schools. In Theravada, which is Southern Buddhism, if you would, which is what we focus on here at the Sati Center, we are definitely on the side of gradual. The Buddha of the early texts frames many of his teachings in the form of what's called the gradual training. Some of you may have even taken Lee Brasington's classes on the gradual training. He likes to teach about that and has done so a number of times here. So we have this idea of an extended path of development. And I'll quote from the Majjhima Nikaya, where the Buddha says, I do not say that final knowledge is achieved all at once. On the contrary, final knowledge is achieved by gradual training, gradual practice, gradual progress. And in another sutta, he gives the image of the ocean gradually sloping down as an analogy for gradually deepening in our practice. So it's clear that these Dhamma in brief teachings are not about getting some kind of a special transmission or something that will zap the mind into awakening. And yet, as I said, this is a particular form of sutta. There's this repeated phrase that appears in all of them. And there's 44 of them, which is enough to be noticeable. So my interpretation is that the Buddha is saying that having a simple and clear and wisdom-oriented focus for a period of intensive practice actually does have the potential to be very fruitful for a person. He is acknowledging that this is possible. So then maybe what we can understand is that there is some kind of preparation of the mind that has to go on in order to be ready to receive a pithy teaching and to use it well on retreat. So the gradual training says we can prepare ourselves by cultivating certain qualities or organizing our life in certain ways. And if we do all of that, then we have conditions in place that if we hear one of these brief teachings and go and practice with it, then the mind would be ready to shift. So another thing that we'll talk about in this class is to consider what conditions might have had to be in place for that person to receive the Dharma at that level. And this too is valuable for us as practitioners, right? We need to know we don't have the benefit of going to the literal Buddha and saying, please give me the Dharma in brief. But we can prepare our mind well with all of these conditions that the Buddha suggests would be good preparations, so that when we read a text, hear a Dharma talk, go on a retreat, and receive, the specific teachings of that, who knows, one of them may land and really, really support us. And my hope is also because of that maybe we'll do some short meditations during these classes. And then in the second and the third classes, we'll expand out a bit to consider this general phenomenon of a pithy teaching that captures the essence of the Dharma for a mind that's ready to hear it. There are other ways that appears, and so I want to, we'll dig into that more later. Okay. So I think now we're ready to start looking at the suttas that are about the Dhamma in brief. So at a top level, as I said, there are 44 of them. And in these cases, the monastics, it's always a monastic, by the way, who asks. And so a monastic asks for instructions in order to go off and practice alone. Actually, only 43 of them, it's like that. There's one exception, but close enough. So then the first question that we might want to ask is, what topics are most frequently offered? What does the Buddha most often say in answer to that question? Is it just all over the map? Are there only 2 things that he offers? What does it look like? So if he had to encapsulate his teaching, what would he say? But I'm not going to tell you right away because I want to gather some guesses from you. So I'm curious, what do you think you would say if you said, please teach me the Dhamma in brief so that I may go off and practice diligent, ardent, and resolute? What topics or ways of practicing would he offer? And as a hint, I found that nearly all of them had one practice subject that he wanted the person to focus on, and then kind of a wisdom focus to apply to that subject. And you could try to guess either one of those. You can write them in the chat, or you're welcome to unmute and just, we can have a few popcorn style answers. Don't be shy. You can guess a prominent Dhamma topic, and there won't be any
dukkha.
Dukkha, says Fred.
Yeah, the Dharma in.
Yeah, I think that's right up there, right? Because the teachings are about ending dukkha, so he would want people to perhaps to look at dukkha. Great. And impermanence, someone has written in the chat, anatta. So we have the 3 characteristics named. We're going to talk about those later in case not everybody knows those. Death and aging, okay. Other ideas? These are all good. Not me, not mine. Sila, so ethics. Very nice. Abandoning the hindrances. Emptiness. I love these. These are all great candidates. The Brahmaviharas, mindfulness, suffering, like dukkha, like Fred said. Okay. Pliant mind, how to use the breath. Practice. Okay. These are really good. So now let's see if I can share my screen. Yeah. I'll show you the list. It's hard to get all 44 on, so you can see that, right? Yeah. So I want to draw your attention to this column that's the second from the right, and that's the one that names the key teachings. So the subject in all of these first ones, here is something called the aggregates, and we'll talk about what that is. And this set is 11 suttas together, SN 23.23 through 33. So that's a lot there. And the aggregates, and then the sense bases, I'm just looking at the first part, goes down. And then, if I can scan down a bit, we have ethics. There's sila, and it eventually goes to a few more specific ones. There are the Brahma Viharas that are a little bit more obscure. The sense bases and the aggregates are the popular ones. And now look at the second part, the wisdom part. The three characteristics, anatta, not delighting, that's a popular one, non-clinging. The three characteristics, that's anicca, dukkha, anatta, impermanence, suffering, not self. So I want to say congratulations, you guys got the wisdom part really quite far down, and you will get a copy of this handout after the, so I'd be happy to send it to you. Want to have a look at this. And so I want to talk a little bit. I have to stop the share. Can't see quickly. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about that. So 23 of them are on the 5 aggregates as the subject for meditation. 11 of them, so 23, this is out of 44, right? So a little more than half. And then 11 of them are on the 6 sense bases. So those two together make up more than 75%. That's the main thing the Buddha wants us to look at, is the aggregates and the sense bases, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. 5 of them are on ethics or sila, and then they go on after that. All the ones on ethics go on to have the person practice the 4 foundations of mindfulness. So somebody also mentioned mindfulness. So for some reason, the ethics and the 4 foundations go together. And then there are a few on the focusing on what the true teachings of the Buddha are, 2 of them, and a couple other things. So the aggregates are a big one. We'll talk about that in a moment. And then the wisdom focus is generally either on the 3 characteristics. So, and if you don't know that phrase, I'm going to talk through it in a moment. So looking at certain aspects, we don't just look at the 5 aggregates in general. We look at how they are impermanent, how they're unreliable, how they're uncontrollable. Or else some form of non-delight or non-clinging. Makes sense because, the claim in the Noble Truths is that grasping or craving is the reason that we suffer in some way. So focusing on not holding on to these things would be an obvious practice. So what do you think? Is that what you expected? I think it's not too bad. But I don't know about the part about the aggregates, right? And the because we don't focus on those too much in our Western teaching. You might get it on retreat, but in a general, like a Dharma talk at an insight center somewhere, you might not hear about the aggregates for a while in your practice. It's not a very common topic. So I thought it was worth saying a little bit about that. We won't go into a lot of detail. This isn't a class about that, but I think you should know what they are if they're going to account for more than half of the Dhamma in brief teachings, obviously considered very important. So we'll just talk about the aggregates in brief. How about that? So the aggregates are the domains of experience around which we tend to organize our sense of self. And so there are different opinions on whether or not the 5 aggregates add up to all of experience, or whether they only add up to part of experience. That's not so important here. I'm not going to worry about that. What we notice here is that the Buddha wanted people to practice directly with aspects of experience that we tend to identify with. Like he thought that was a key if you were going off to practice intensively. So the first aggregate is pretty easy to understand. It's the body and other material things in life. So we often think of the body as me and mine. or we personalize various sense experiences like sounds. That's a common physical experience. Maybe we think that a certain sound shouldn't be happening because it bothers me. It bothers me, right? So it becomes something that we've identified with as an aspect of our experience and have an opinion about it in that sense. In a conventional sense, it's fine to think of your body as yours, and it's fine to talk about the way sounds are affecting you. That's not a problem. But if we get more precise, like if we were in intensive meditation, we would see that the material world is not really us or ours, not really me or mine. Even the body, even the body. I mean, as a top level understanding of that, just a conceptual understanding, there's definitely no molecule in your body that you've had the whole time since birth. I'm pretty sure of that. So which molecules are really you? So that's only a conceptual way of seeing it, but it opens the door a little bit, and then in practice we could really get a direct understanding of that. And then the other four aggregates, as they're called, are more about the mind, their feeling tone, whether things are pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, perception or conceptualization, the way we decide what something is, label it in some way, volitional formation, so various actions we take with the mind through intention, thinking, or emotions or intentions. And then the knowing aspect of the mind, the part of the mind that can know experience. And that all of these are also not really me or mine. Maybe it's even easier to see it in that case because they come and go so readily. Whereas the body, we kind of keep that for a while, even though we get that the molecules aren't the same. The body has a feeling of continuity to it and it changes more slowly than the mind. So we're not aiming to think about this, though. These people going off on retreat were wanting to practice in meditation with the aggregates or sense bases or anything else. And so the way to do that most frequently is to notice what are called these three characteristics. And the first of them, I'll just describe those also because, again, it's something that we ought to know about, since the Buddha really highlighted this quite strongly in his Dhamma in brief teachings. So the first of these is impermanence or inconstancy, which is also called anicca in Pali. And in that case, we pay attention to the aspect of something that is changing. Either that it's literally coming and going, like the breath comes and goes each cycle, or that something is shifting. It's not constant. We have a certain impression as we go outside that the sun is warm, and we think, oh, how nice. And then after 10 minutes of walking, the sun is too hot. And it's changed from, pleasant to unpleasant or something. And so it's the same sun, probably. It hasn't changed that much in 10 minutes, but our experience of it has changed. So we notice these shifts, the way that the mind is always changing, shifting, experience comes and goes, isn't constant for us. And there's a way that slowly loosens us up from various kinds of ways that we cling onto things or think that they should be the same or think that they should be reliable for us, which takes us into the second characteristic of unreliability or unsatisfactoriness. Things that are shifting and changing are not going to be reliable sources of happiness for us, especially, if they come and go in some natural way. Like this is a little extreme, I don't know how many people are like this, but if you were only happy when the sun was out, that would be a problem, right? That would be, there would definitely be times when you couldn't be happy because the sun comes and goes on a day and night cycle and also behind clouds. So that wouldn't be very wise. And yet all the time we bank our happiness on things that do change, like our car, our house, our health, things that are not reliable. And then there's the third characteristic is impersonality or anatta. Someone wrote emptiness, so that's a related idea, is the sense that things are not really me or mine. And like I said, in a conventional way, no problem. But in a deeper sense, we start to see, oh, there's really no controllability of this. There's no way that I can really claim it and hold on to it and be the owner of it forever, only in a conventional way. So looking at these characteristics has a way, each one of them has a different way of loosening the mind a little bit around ways that it would easily get stuck. And then the same is true for the what are called the six sense species, same practice. And in case you haven't heard that term, those are, we consider the mind to be one of the senses. So we have seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, and other bodily senses, and the mind as the six sense species. And again, there's the examining of this in terms of the three characteristics and examining them very carefully in light of these wisdom qualities. So, in general, the Buddha is asking practitioners to release the way that we hold on to the aggregates and the sense bases. So, the question is, when you sit on the cushion and meditate, is this what you're doing? I know we're focusing on the breath or whatever else it is, but there are ways in which we get caught up in doing other things. And it's not that we would only do these Dhamma in brief practices. There, as I said, there's many, many practices in the Pali Canon. How could the Buddha even condense them into something simple? But it's worth noting, just bearing in mind that these are the ones that he really zeroes in on. And so at some point, even if it's not, today or tomorrow or next month, at some point, it's worth directing the mind in this way, or just trusting that if you hear a class like this and kind of absorb in it, your mind will naturally want to go in that direction at some point when it's appropriate. So then maybe it's also worth mentioning the broad results. I hinted at this just earlier. So in 32 out of the 44 cases, awakening happened because of going on this retreat where the person heard this teaching and practiced with it. And in quite a few of the others, the person was awakened later. The person is, we know who the person is, it's a known character in the suttas. And even though nothing happened for them on that particular retreat, at least as far as we're told, we do know that sometime later that person awakened. Like, for example, one of these teachings was given to the Buddha's son, Rahula, and he doesn't wake up from hearing the Dhamma in brief, but we do have another sutta in the Pali Canon where he does wake up. So we know that these were all probably pretty stellar practitioners. So they were effective teachings for the most part, but again, not a guarantee that in that given period of practice the person would awaken. So as the Dhammapada verse says, we have to do our own work. So this is kind of a flyover, top level look. And I'm curious if there are questions. In fact, I'd like there to be, if you have questions about this and anything else about these Dhamma in brief teachings, the people they were given to, the uses of them, whether or not you've practiced them, what do the five aggregates really mean, things like that. And I can't quite see all of you, so if it's possible to raise your Zoom hand, that would be great, which is down under the reactions button in the bottom bar. Oh yeah, Fred.
The one I'm most familiar with is Baha'i, the bark cloth. In the seen, there's the seen and the unseen. In the hearing,
The
there's
Bahia instructions, yeah.
yeah, that's the most famous one that I've heard, and I've heard that taught fairly often on insight retreats. But I'm not sure that I've heard that many. That's the one that comes to mind if I was to come up with a teaching in brief. But that's definitely one of the aggregate ones and sense
This is
based.
great. Oh, go ahead.
No, that's all.
Okay, yeah, this is great. So he's referring to a teaching that was given to a practitioner named Bahia. And you've actually perfectly previewed that I'm going to talk a little bit about that just after this, because that was, in fact, one of the Dhamma in Brief teachings. It's part of a Dhamma in Brief that includes more than one. And we'll look at that one actually in a moment because it's an interesting story. So yeah, that's it's a teaching that asks the person to look. It's basically about the sense bases, to look very carefully at the sense bases and see that they're and not allow the mind to proliferate about them, and therefore not allow a self to form. So we'll talk about that in a moment, but that is a perfect example, and that is talked about a lot on retreats, in retreats, um, because it's such a wonderful teaching on how to do uh, essentially practice that's very simple, bare awareness practice. Yeah, yeah. What else?
Sorry, I can't figure out how to raise my hand.
Hey, Carrie, yeah.
Apologize. I love the chart. I love charts, and just my brain was like, yes. And I'm just curious, I was kind of looking at them, and have you seen any patterns, like what kinds of teachings led to enlightenment versus the ones that didn't right away? Is there any sort of patterns that you saw?
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. Why don't we pull it back up? My suspicion is that, so, we can see that there's kind of a mix throughout the aggregates and also a mix throughout the sense bases. This last column, um, it's kind of yeah, it just says yes or no. And then, so it's kind of mixed throughout. These later ones were often, the ethical ones did pretty well. Um, but I think it has to do, so I think good question, does it have to do with the teachings? I thought about that and seeing that there wasn't much pattern, my sense is it has to do with the person, actually. So, a given yogi might or might not have been ready at that moment. And I didn't put on here who the teaching was given to, it was getting too wide. But there are some that were given, for example, to Ananda, who we know didn't awaken until after the Buddha's death, and another monk named Radha, who got a lot of deep teachings, but his awakening isn't mentioned. So I think it has to do more with the particular monk uh, than with the teaching itself. Any of these, it seems clear that any of these would be good enough, but aren't necessarily. Uh, but it's a good question. Yeah. Anything else at this point? So, then let's look now at one of these cases. I thought we would zero in a little bit on one of the teachings. Some of the people that the Buddha gave his nuggets to, if you will, were people that he had known for a long time. And one of these folks is a interesting monk named Malankya and he was known, Malankaputta was known for his interest in philosophical questions. An earlier exchange with the Buddha occurs in Majjhima Nikaya 63, anyone who wants to look that up. And so Malankaputta was sitting in meditation and he became vexed by a lot of questions about the nature of the universe and what happens to Buddhas after they die. And his mind got all wrapped up in this speculative thinking. Is the universe infinite or finite? Is it eternal or non-eternal? Is the soul the same as the body or different? And, do Buddhas go away when they die? Or do they exist? Do they not exist? So all these kind of questions. And so he he resolves that he's going to go to the Buddha and he's going to get answers to his questions, or else he's going to leave the order and not be a monk anymore. So he goes off, he marches off to the Buddha, and he asks his questions, but the Buddha refuses to answer him. And he points out to Malankaputta, hey, when you were ordained, did I tell you that I would answer these questions for you? And Malankaputta has to admit, well, no, actually, that wasn't part of the bargain when I ordained. And so then the Buddha gives the famous simile of a person who's shot by an arrow and says, imagine that somebody has been shot by an arrow, and his colleagues and family and friends drag him off the battlefield, and they're going to try to help him. But he says to them, wait, before you pull out of the arrow, I need to know what kind of wood the shaft of the arrow is made of, what kind of feathers are in the arrow. I need to know if it was an arrow that was carved or if it was tempered in a fire. I need to know who shot the arrow, and was it shot from a bow that was strung with catgut or with something else. I need to know if the person was from the merchant class or the Brahmin class or the warrior class who shot the arrow, etc. And the Buddha goes on and even longer than I did about all these different conditions. And he says, and meanwhile, while trying to get the answers to all that, demanding the answers to all those questions, the person would die, for not having the arrow pulled out. So it's kind of a powerful image for Malankaputta, who's, the person who's been shot, right, with the arrow of suffering, but he's demanding to know all these irrelevant things before he's willing to awaken. And the Buddha gives him a little bit of a pith teaching there in that particular sutta, not in the, pericope framed stock answer, stock question kind of way, but he says, look, all your questions are not about the fundamentals of the spiritual life. What is about the fundamentals of the spiritual life? Suffering, its cause, its end, and the path to its end. So he gives him a summary of the Four Noble Truths. And so, fortunately, Malankaputta backs off in that case and does stay ordained and continues to practice. So gets more chances. And so now, in this particular sutta that we're talking about here in the Dhamma and Brief teachings, he has a different exchange with the Buddha. And he starts out with the classic line that begins all of these. He says, Venerable Sir, it would be good if the Blessed One would teach me the Dhamma in brief, so that, having heard the Dhamma from the Blessed One, I might dwell alone, withdrawn, diligent, ardent, and resolute. And the Buddha teases him, and he says, Hear now, Malankaputta, what should I say to young bhikkhus when a bhikkhu like you, old, aged, burdened with years, advanced in life, come to the last stage, asks me for an exhortation in brief? So he says, hey, so Malankaputta is an old monk by now. He's no longer a young whippersnapper asking philosophical questions. And the Buddha says, hey, why should I mean, he doesn't quite say, why should I, but he teases him a little bit, come on. And so, but Malankaputta comes up with a really sincere response. And he says, although, Venerable Sir, I am old, aged, burdened with years, advanced in life, and come to the last stage, let the Blessed One teach me the Dhamma in brief. Let the fortunate one teach me the Dhamma in brief. Perhaps I may understand the meaning of the Blessed One's statement. Perhaps I may become an heir to the Blessed One's statement. So he says, maybe I can do it. And the Buddha is compassionate to him, and so he gives him a teaching. First, he asks him some questions about whether he would be attached to things that he's never even heard of or knew about. And of course, he says, no, if I didn't know about it, I couldn't be attached to it. And then he gives him the teaching that Fred anticipated that was also given to Bahia. Usually we hear about it in the case of Bahia, but it was also given to Malankaputta, word for word. And he says, well, I'm summarizing a little bit. He says, Here, Malankaputta, regarding things seen, heard, sensed, and cognized by you, In the seen, there will be merely the seen. In the heard, there will be merely the heard. In the sensed, there will be merely the sensed. And in the cognized, there will be merely the cognized. And so this is a very brief teaching. If you just hear that at a conceptual level, you think, well, okay. But this is not so easy to execute in practice. How often do we sit in meditation and we're planning to, in the breath, let's say, in the breath, there will be just the breath. Right. We sit there and we breathe in, but then the mind says, oh, what was I going to do tomorrow? Blah, blah, blah. And then we have a little pain in our knee, and the mind says, oh, I wonder what that is. I wonder if my knee is going to get even more sore. It's only been 18 minutes into my meditation and I was going to sit for 45 minutes. How am I going to survive? So it clearly isn't the case that the sensation in the knee was just the sensation in the knee. The mind went off with it in some way. This is very common. So the Buddha's saying, look at that tendency, right? It's the perfect teaching for somebody whose mind goes off into speculation very easily. That was Malankaputa's habit and tendency. So he says, really be careful about that. Really keep your mind in the present moment. And Malankaputta, in that moment, even before he even goes off to practice, he says, oh, I understand. I understand what you mean. And the Buddha doesn't quite believe him. And he says, could you repeat back? Could you tell me how you understand what I just told you? And I won't read the whole thing, but Malankaputta gives some beautiful verses about how previously he'd been dwelling with what he calls muddled mindfulness, where he would think of something and then he would grasp onto it and start ruminating on it or start desiring it and wanting more of it. He had a mind that was very undisciplined in terms of grabbing on to things that appeared in his mind and making them into stuff that he wanted to think about. And so he says this was muddled. And then he says, if I could just be with things as they are and just let each moment come and go, then I would be able to stay in the present moment. And for me, in the seen, just the seen, in the heard, just the heard, etc. And because of that, there would be no chance of a self forming. It would just be the experience, empty of an experiencer, empty of a commentary, empty of a judgment. And he explains all of this to the Buddha. And the Buddha says, very good. Now go on retreat. And there's a happy ending. I'll read it. This is again a pericope that's read and that's said in all the cases where somebody awakens. He says, then, dwelling alone, withdrawn, diligent, ardent, and resolute, the Venerable Malankaputta, by realizing for himself, with direct knowledge, in this very life, entered and dwelled in that unsurpassed goal of the spiritual life, for the sake of which clansmen rightly go forth from the household life into homelessness. He directly knew, destroyed his birth, the spiritual life has been lived, what had to be done has been done, there is no more for this state of being. And the Venerable Malankaputta became one of the Arahants. So it kind of tugs at my heart that this monk who almost gave up, when he was young, and then practiced and practiced. I mean, how many decades after that did he practice and not have any result, particularly? Finally, as an old man, he got this teaching that was just the right thing, and he was sincere and ready to do it. And he understood the teaching and became free. So it's really quite sweet. I think I have the feeling that this is one of my evidences that the Dhamma and brief teachings might have been tailored to the person. I mean, why not? The Buddha could know the minds of people if they asked for a teaching in brief. He could give them something that would be potentially fruitful for them. Not guaranteed. The Buddha can't make anything happen in that way, but he can give something that would be the best chance for that person. So I said that we would talk also a little bit about the conditionality of this transformation, what it is that allowed these people to go off on retreat with a simple instruction and go really far with it. I don't know, maybe that was a good enough Bahiya instruction or Malankaputta instruction for you to go very far on this sit. I'm not sure, but when I consider, that kind of fair awareness meditation, I think it's quite beautiful. So in this case, and in really all of the cases of these Dhamma in brief teachings, they were monks and nuns who asked the Buddha for this teaching. So one condition for them was that they already had faith in the Buddha's teachings, a lot of faith. And they had a dedicated life of practice that allowed them to do retreat. And then in addition, they were going off to do practice in seclusion, so that it wasn't a big bang moment at that moment, as I said before, but they're really going to implement this concise teaching in some kind of a practice. And the implication, I think, is that they know how to do that. So they've had enough exposure to hearing the Buddha's teachings, hearing him answer questions, talking with fellow monastics, that they have a sense of, if they get an instruction that's very concise, like, check out the 5 aggregates in terms of anicca, they would have an understanding maybe of how to implement that on the cushion. Whereas someone without some of those other conditions of faith and a dedicated life of practice and so forth might get a little bit lost with a simple instruction like that. So something we can reflect on in terms of going through transformation in our own practice is the degree to which we're learning how to implement teachings that we hear or read. These suttas they have instructions in them. Many of them do, actually, but sometimes they're not quite as simple as the instructions for, changing the light bulb or something like that, where it's said, or, assembling something where it says put tab A in slot B first. But they're a little bit more interpretive or, in the way that they're presented. So this is something we can check in our own practice is, for example, if we hear a lot of guided meditations in our practice, are we then able to do it on our own without a voice at some point? Or have we learned enough of the teachings, like we've read enough or studied enough or gone to enough classes at the Sati Center or something that we have a sense of the way the suttas are structured, and if we hear a certain teaching, we would know generally what area of practice that refers to, something like that. So, there are various conditions that are, that we can extract from these Dhamma in brief teachings to inform our own practice in a practical way. So as a possible exercise, I would invite that it might be interesting to choose one of the Dhamma in brief teachings, and you'll get the list after this class, and check it out over and, see, play around with it a little bit. It doesn't have to, I know we're not going off on retreat, but there are a lot of ways to do them in kind of even a daily life way. So just as an example, suppose that you took up one of the 6 sense bases and impermanence. And so maybe you could look at the impermanence of tastes, right? This is a practical application of that general teaching. Tastes are really impermanent. I mean, they're really impermanent. The mouth cycles saliva through so fast that even if you leave a taste in your mouth, like after brushing your teeth, for example, it's gone. How long does it take for the toothpaste taste to go away? Have you ever noticed? It's pretty fast. It's on the order of minutes. And that has to do with, how quickly the saliva cycles through, and also our own attention, right? After a taste goes down below a certain threshold level, we don't really notice it. And so there might be a little bit of mint left, or whatever flavor you use, but we don't notice it after a little while. So check it out, and then if you're eating the taste changes even faster. Actually, I mean, we get a big hit of it, but then pretty quickly, like within 5 or 6 bites, chews, a particular bite of food is already much less flavorful than it was at the beginning, which is why we're already putting directed our attention back to the fork to get the next one in, to get that next hit. So, right there in the impermanence of the sense base of taste, it's pretty interesting to watch what the mind does with that and how attention moves around that whole realm of taste, which we don't get to use very often because a lot of the time we don't have a taste. So, that's just one idea. Another one is still with the sense bases. We could work with sound and the uncontrollability of it. That's an aspect of anatta. So we can't, for example, predict what sound is going to happen next and how loud it's going to be. We generally have an idea. Here you are sitting in a class and you expect that what you're going to continue to hear is a voice at about the level that it's at. But I could just go silent for 5 minutes. Okay, we'll go for all 5 minutes, but it's that could happen, or the fire alarm could go off in your building, and we don't have control over that, over what happens next. And this isn't a problem most of the time, but if you start to pay attention to it, it becomes kind of interesting to the mind, or it might. To consider how we interact with that world of sound and its true uncontrollability. At least in the much of the time, we make some sounds deliberately, and we know they're going to happen, but not all of them. And so then the practice is to do that and see what happens, see what insights might come. This is essentially what the Buddha was offering people. Look at the sense bases, look at the aggregates, look at and check out how they are impermanent or unsatisfactory or unreliable or uncontrollable or otherwise not self. These are very practical teachings that happen all the time in daily life, and we would be sprinkling our mind with little bits of wisdom if we did that. So I'm curious, I'll give another opportunity for questions or comments on these 44 teachings or the way to implement them or anything you might have from the meditation. Well, I did want to give you a chance also to have a chance to talk with each other a little bit. So we're going to it's very short. We don't have much time left, but wanted to give you a chance to go into breakout rooms. And then I have a little bit of summary at the end that will lead us into what we're going to do in the next class. So I'm going to start making the breakout rooms, but in the meantime, the question is, how do you relate to this sense of a Dhamma in brief teaching within a tradition that has a long, a gradual path? How does that land for you? Are you wishing it would be more sudden and you were coming to this class hoping to find out the magic teaching for awakening? Or are you very content with the path and you never think about, at some moment my mind might transform, not interesting? And now knowing like how the Buddha encapsulated his teachings into these little wisdom pith nuggets that we have to do preparation. Does that have any? How does that kind of land for where your practice is now? If you look at your practice and then this sense of the gradual ripening that could burst at a given moment, How do those come together for you? And it's a short time, but if each person could kind of just share some thoughts about that, I think you'll find it fruitful and maybe get another perspective. That's the aim, is let's try to have 3 or 4 different perspectives come up in the group. Okay, so does anyone have anything they'd like to share from that brief time? Any wisdom to offer to the group?
I don't know if it will qualify as wisdom, but it was an appreciation that we got to do the meditation we did, and the language of the sutta. I wasn't 100% finding my way into it, how to work with it. And so there was a certain, I guess, dryness or inaccessibility to it. And then it was like adding water and constituting and making it alive for me. So I just really appreciated that.
Thank you. Yeah. I think you've uncovered kind of the essence of these, right? You get the Dhamma in brief, you get a condensate, and then, it's like, how do we implement that? So the suggestion just before the breakout group was that as monks and nuns, these folks would maybe have an idea of how to do that, being really steeped in the Dharma. But yeah, there is a way that these teachings can be rich, like very dense, flourless chocolate cake, something like
exactly.
that. Yeah. Yeah, that's part of the art of this. Thank you for that comment. Yeah. So the Dhamma in brief that we've talked about today, as I mentioned at one point, this is something that only monastics ever asked the Buddha, in terms of at least that very stylized form that I read in these 44 suttas, probably because, only monks and nuns would be going off on retreat, right? In the time of the Buddha, lay people didn't really do that. So the question then is, I think the way we practice, though, here in the West is that many lay people are quite dedicated practitioners, and many of us do go on retreat. But nonetheless, we could ask, is there kind of a layperson version of this? What is there something like that? And of course, it's a leading question because there is. There's another standard form, not the Dhamma in brief, but it's called the graduated discourse. That's not the same thing as the gradual training that I mentioned at the beginning. The graduated discourse is a single Dharma talk that covers a standard sequence of teachings. It always covers the same topics. And the Buddha gave this exclusively to lay people. And there are certain conditions under which it will say then the Buddha gave the layperson so-and-so a step-by-step teaching on, and then it lists all the topics, or a graduated discourse on these certain topics. And we never get to actually hear that discourse. We don't. My suspicion, it was probably different. Again, probably tailored to the person in some way, but it always covers a standard sequence of topics. And at the end of that, the layperson achieves the first stage of awakening in 100% of the cases. So different from this Dhamma in brief, where the monastics, we're talking about full awakening in the case of the monastics. So they would fully wake up a little more than half the time. But for lay people, when they get this graduated discourse, they wake up 100% of the time, that it happens in the suttas at least. So I thought it'd be interesting to look at that also as kind of a parallel example of this. So we'll talk through what is the graduated discourse, but again, with the caveat, what were the conditions that must have been present? Because the Buddha taught lots and lots of lay people, of course, and he didn't choose to give this particular stylized teaching to just anybody. He would choose it in particular cases, presumably because he knew the person was ready. And there's in fact language in the sutta that suggests that he knew that why he thought they were ready. So we'll look at that next time. I thought that would be a nice complement to this one. And meanwhile, have a wonderful week practicing with, if you choose, one of these Dhamma in brief. And see you next week. Be well. Take care. Feel free to unmute and say goodbye.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Kim.
Kim. Good night,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
Thank you, Kim.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Kim.